is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Otelli Edwards. Tonight's top stories. APEC trade ministers sounding the alarm at a meeting in South Korea that export growth in the Asia-Pacific region is set to stall this year on the U.S.-driven trade war. Now, the U.S. issues new guidance warning companies anywhere in the world against using Huawei's chips in a bid to thwart the Chinese firm's advances in high-tech. And for the first time in 3 years, Russia and Ukraine are set for direct talks on ending their conflict. But with Presidents Putin and possibly Trump absent from the negotiations in Turkiye, hopes for any major breakthrough are muted. And also Germany and the Philippines stepping up defense ties, signing a deal to boost cybersecurity and arms cooperation as tensions with Beijing persist in the South China Sea. Also in East Asia tonight, China's renaming of dozens of places in disputed territory with India has prompted a rebuke, with New Delhi saying that the creative move will not change reality. We get an expert's take on how names can shape territorial narratives. And Chinese students wanting to go abroad often look to the U.S. But is the American dream still alive under President Donald Trump's immigration policies? Now, trade ministers from the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Bloc have cautioned that exports in the region will barely grow this year due to the impact of tariffs imposed by the U.S. Well, the group forecasted exports growth to be less than 1%. Well, the warning came as officials from the 21-member bloc convene in South Korea's Jeju Island on Thursday. Well, they've also downgraded their forecast for the region's economic growth, citing a rising protectionism, weaker demand for consumer goods and manufacturing, and uncertainty over U.S. trade policies.
The global environment surrounding APEC members face among many challenges. As cross-border trade and interconnected supply chains continue to expand, growing uncertainties are placing a strain on the global economy and the trade landscape. Given this challenging global trade environment, the role of APEC is more crucial than ever.
Over the next 2 days, delegates will focus on WTO reform and boosting multilateral trade amid growing global tensions. Attention is now on the U.S. and China following their recent breakthrough on tariffs. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer is reported to have met Chinese envoy Li Chenggang on the sidelines, marking a follow-up to their first face-to-face talks in Geneva last week. For more on this, we are joined by Lim Yun-suk, who is at the APEC meeting venue at South Korea's Jeju Island. Yun-suk, U.S. and China, they've met again after Trump said that breakthrough tariff talks were achieved. Tell us a bit more about the details that was being discussed today.
Well, we don't have much details on the meeting. All we know is that the two sides did meet here on the sidelines of this APEC trade ministers meeting that is happening here in Jeju. Now, since, experts had earlier said that since they're both here and it is going to be their first meeting since they last met in Geneva earlier this month, there was no reason why they would not be holding negotiations. And so it seems like they have, but, as to what kind of negotiations they met, they discussed and whether there was any progress made, we're not being told or given any information about that. But all eyes had been on this meeting because it comes following that agreement last month where the U.S. and China agreed to reduce the tariffs against each other. And since, they agreed on the 90-day pause during which both countries will be trying to negotiate further agreements. And some experts here have said that, they could be trying to further negotiate what they agreed in Geneva at this meeting. But for now, we're not getting any details as to what was discussed or whether they did make any kind of progress here in Jeju.
Well, South Korea, I believe they've also had a line of meeting with top officials from different countries. Tell us more about that, what has been discussed and also what will be covered.
Well, we have more details on that. South Korea and China held bilateral meetings on Thursday morning before the official opening of this APEC trade ministers meeting here in Jeju. The South Korea's trade minister, Chung In-kyo, who held talks with China's envoy Lee Chen-sang, told reporters after the meeting that China emphasized the importance of this multilateral system and stated that it is making efforts to maintain this global supply chain. Now, the minister also said that for South Korea, all were very important economic partners, and that is the United States and China. And so from that perspective, South Korea is hoping that China and the United States can resolve the trade issues. Now, on Friday, the U.S. and South Korea will also be meeting here on the sidelines of this meeting. And experts, however, don't think much is going to come out of that meeting between the U.S. representative, Jameson Greer, and An Dok-kun, South Korea's trade industry and energy minister. Now, let's listen to what one expert told the foreign media earlier this week.
제가 보기에는 이거 통상장관들이 만난다고 해서 딱히 결론이 나올 것 같지는 않습니다. 대체적인 방향, 우리가 협력하자 정도의 메시지가 일단 나오지 않겠느냐라고 좀 보고 있고요. 일본이 그렇게 공을 들였음에도 아무런 성과가 없었다.
So as we heard there, not much is expected from that meeting, but experts are saying that it is significant because it is the first meeting between the two countries since they last month agreed in Washington to come up with a package deal, so-called a July package deal, and some kind of economic cooperation. Now, the experts say that it is important to have some kind of contact ongoing, especially now when South Korea doesn't have a leader. South Koreans will be going to the polls to elect a new president on June 3rd, following the impeachment of former President Yoon Suk-yeol. So whoever becomes the new president will have to resume discussions with Washington. And until then, it is good to keep this the talks going with the United States. Now, also on Friday, very interestingly, is that Mr. Greer is scheduled to meet with the CEOs of Hanwha Ocean and Hyundai Heavy, which is the country's largest and one of the world's largest shipbuilder. Now, it's very possible, experts are saying, that he will be discussing, with these two companies, some kind of strategic cooperation in shipbuilding, since the United States is keen to bolster its shipbuilding industry, which has been a priority under President Donald Trump's America First trade policy.
We look forward to more details in the coming days. Thank you so very much for that report. CNA's Lim Yun-suk, live from Jeju, South Korea. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump now says that India has offered a trade deal with, quote, no tariffs. New Delhi was hit with a 26% tariff hike and is now trying to work out a deal with Washington within their 90-day pause. Mr. Trump was speaking in Doha while on tour in the Middle East.
It's very hard to sell into India, and they've offered us a deal where basically they're willing to literally charge us no tariff.
And for more of our coverage on Trump's tariffs, do head over to CNA.Asia for the very latest. Peace talks between Russia and Ukraine are expected to get underway today in Turkish capital Istanbul with the aim of ending the 3-year-long war. Well, the Turkish foreign minister has expressed hopes that talks in Istanbul will open a new chapter. But the absence of Russian President Vladimir Putin, as well as other top Russian officials from the negotiating table, has lowered expectations of a major breakthrough. Mr. Trump says he could still travel to Turkey tomorrow if the first direct talks between Ukrainian and Russian delegations make progress. Well, the American leader, sounding a note of optimism, says that they believe they will do well with Russia and Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Ukraine will decide on its next steps after his meeting with his Turkish counterpart, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, in Ankara. Our NATO foreign ministers, meantime, are holding informal meetings in the south of Turkiye, Antalya, with the war in focus. Top U.S. diplomat Marco Rubio, ahead of those talks, says there can be no military solution to the conflict and emphasized that America is open to any mechanism to get peace in Ukraine. The NATO chief, meanwhile, expressed cautious optimism for a breakthrough in peace talks.
Ukraine is ready to commit to a ceasefire and immediate negotiations. That's absolutely clear. The ball is now clearly in Russia's court. They have to explain what they are doing, why they are here or not, and with what team or whatever. But let's make sure that we all understand that the ball is in their court.
All right, for more, let's go over to Ross Cullen, live from Istanbul. Ross, first up, let's talk about the challenges, what lie ahead for Ukrainian and Russian delegates as they try to work towards an end to this war.
Yeah, that's right, Teddy. We have had that definitive confirmation from the Kremlin that Russian President Vladimir Putin will not be here in Turkey on Thursday. Speaking a little bit earlier in Moscow, Maria Zakharova, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, said that Russia was ready for serious talks with the Ukrainian delegation, and this will be their first in-person talks since 2022, since they met here in Istanbul more than 3 years ago. So a crucial day for the overall diplomacy and trying to bring Russia and Ukraine closer to the position where they can both agree an immediate ceasefire. Those talks were due to get underway this morning local time. They've been delayed for a few hours until this afternoon local time. Now, somebody who is here in Turkey is President Zelensky of Ukraine. He is in the Turkish capital, Ankara, meeting Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan right now, and we understand that the Turkish president will be calling for an immediate ceasefire. That is something that the United States wants to see. That is something that Ukraine has signed up for. That is something that Europe would like to see. They are now trying to present it, Ukraine and Europe, and then perhaps even the United States, that Russia needs to make the next move to come closer to a ceasefire. However, Moscow says that there are many other technical issues that need to be discussed first, notably the root causes of the war, according to Moscow, before they can reach the arena where they are feeling comfortable to discuss the introduction of a ceasefire. Now, Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, Steve Witkoff, the US Middle East envoy, and Keith Kellogg, the US Russia-Ukraine envoy, all of them are expected here in Istanbul tomorrow to join in those talks. And it hasn't been ruled out. Something that remains a possibility is that President Trump could also be here on Friday. Now, he ruled out coming to Turkey today, along with President Putin not in attendance at those talks. But it remains something that could happen tomorrow if, according to the US leader, it is deemed appropriate.
We'll certainly be looking out for that. In the meantime, I want to turn our attention to the NATO foreign ministers. They're working towards stepping up some kind of collective security as they meet in the south of Turkey. Do we know what measures they are looking into?
Yeah, that's right. They're meeting in Antalya on the Mediterranean coast. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio is there. He has been having conversations. They are being hosted by the Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, and also in attendance the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha. And we have had a little bit of news from him this morning. He has had a meeting with his French counterpart, Jean-Noël Barrot, and Mr. Sybiha said that ways that there could be a stepping up of support for Ukraine and a stepping up of the pressure being increased on Moscow is through increasing the cost of the war to the aggressor, in Mr. Sybiha's words, also introducing tougher sanctions and additional strengthening for the Ukrainian armed forces. David Lammy, who's the British Foreign Secretary, has said that what NATO really wants to do is to try to step up and enforce and try to put Mr. Putin in a position where he really has to commit to a ceasefire. Those NATO foreign ministers are also discussing laying out the groundwork for the major summit next month, which will be the NATO Leaders Summit, where we expect Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron, among others, to attend in the Netherlands. Ateli?
All right, thanks very much for that report. Ross Cullen, live in Istanbul. A time now for a short break, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, a growing consumer backlash threatens Xiaomi's runaway EV sales success as new orders dwindle. And Japan's biggest lenders benefiting from increased corporate activity despite the economic outlook muddied by President Trump's sweeping tariffs. Hello again. You're watching East Asia Tonight, and it is now time for a business news with Roland Lim. And Roland, let's talk about Japan's lenders. They appear to have turned the corner for good. Is that right?
Right. It's the end of deflation in Japan, and the Bank of Japan ending its policy of negative interest rates in March last year as well as hiking rates twice since, have raised lending margins for Japanese banks. More on that in a bit, but first, the Trump administration is taking a tougher stance on Huawei and Chinese technology advances. It has warned that any company using Huawei-made artificial intelligence chips anywhere in the world could attract criminal penalties for potentially violating U.S. export controls. The directive from the U.S. Commerce Department is based on the assumption that Huawei chips, especially its Ascend processors, are made using U.S. tech. The Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security clarified that the new measure was part of the administration's more stringent approach to foreign AI chips. It added that the Bureau has not issued any rule, but has merely widened the interpretation of U.S. export controls. Experts suggest the latest clampdown comes as policymakers in Washington have been left stunned by the pace Huawei developed these chips. The Chinese chip giant claims its advanced AI chip cluster outperforms the comparable product made by U.S. rival NVIDIA. The move also comes just a day after Washington and Beijing announced a trade truce, an agreement seen as a major turning point in trade tensions between the two sides. China's Commerce Ministry says that it would take steps to defend the rights and interests of its companies. Xiaomi is seeing a slump in new orders for its SU7 electric sedan as the Chinese company grapples with mounting consumer backlash. The decline comes after a deadly accident involving the sporty electric vehicle back in March, raising concerns about the safety of Xiaomi's smart driving technology. Orders for Xiaomi's SU7 sedan plunged to around 36,000 units in April, and that's down 55% month on month. There were only 13,500 new orders in the first 2 weeks of May, and that's down from a weekly peak of some 23,000 units in March, according to Deutsche Bank. The slump also comes amid false advertising about a $6,000 carbon fiber hood upgrade on the SU7 Ultra. Now, nearly 400 buyers have requested refunds after discovering the hood lacks functional air vents, contrary to Xiaomi's earlier claims. Customers have also called out inflated delivery times, questioning whether Xiaomi is creating a false sense of scarcity to boost demand. Xiaomi's share price closing 0.5% lower in Hong Kong today. Meanwhile, Hong Kong-listed Geely Automobile Holdings reported a sharp rise in first quarter profit, driven by increased sales and ongoing cost-cutting efforts. The results comes as the automaker strengthened its position in China's fiercely competitive electric vehicle market. Now, in the first 3 months of the year, revenue rose 25% to $10 billion on year, missing market estimates by 5%. Meanwhile, net income more than tripled to $786 million on year, surpassing estimates by more than 36%. Share price for the day closing up 0.84%. China's second largest EV maker achieved record sales in the first quarter and saw robust growth in the new energy business. Its total sales volume jumped 48% during the period. Popular models such as the electric Xingyuan hatchback as well as the Xingyue L sports utility vehicle among the best-selling vehicles. However, like other Chinese automakers, Geely is facing headwinds. The EU's tariffs on Chinese EVs and weak consumer sentiment in Russia, where Geely is a top seller, are impacting exports. Overseas deliveries grew just 2% in the first quarter, compared with a 66% surge a year earlier. Japan's third biggest lender, Mizuho, posted a record annual profit as the end of deflation proved a boon for Japan's largest banks. For the fiscal 2024, net profit was at $6 billion. That's a 30% increase on year. Now, this is despite its fourth quarter net profit dropping 18% to $207 million. The results follows those of Japan's second biggest banking group, Sumitomo Mitsui, which announced a record $8 billion in annual net profit yesterday. Demand for commercial loans has swelled as the economy emerges from decades of deflation. spurring mergers and acquisitions, growth investments overseas, as well as capital expenditure. That's been supported by rising interest rates. The Bank of Japan ended its policy of negative interest rates in March last year and hiked rates twice thereafter. Higher rates are boosting net interest margins, profits, and share prices of the country's largest lenders. Chinese stocks ended lower, snapping 3 days of gains as investors digested the local lending data amid easing US-China trade tensions. Shanghai Composite lost 0.7%, the Shenzhen component declining by 1.6%, led by AI and defense counters. Hong Kong shares also succumbed to profit-taking, tech counters leading the losers. Tencent shares in Hong Kong edged lower after profit increased 14%, falling short of the anticipated 23% growth. Its bread-and-butter gaming business continued to grow. Alibaba set to come up with a report card today as investors await details on advertising and cloud revenue growth. Bloomberg survey expects profit to rise 23% and revenue to gain 7% on year. JD.com, China's biggest e-commerce retailer, is the biggest percentage loser here despite earnings earlier this week that topped estimates. The Chinese yuan still holding on to gains that followed Beijing and Washington's rollback of tariff rates. Now that level also comes as the PBOC cuts the bank's reserve requirement ratio, which takes effect today. Policymakers reduce the amount of cash that banks must hold in reserve in a bid to boost lending. Bank of Singapore's Eli Lee explains how the easing of US-China trade tensions could be a catalyst for riskier assets to regain upward momentum.
I think, there's a little bit of bias fatigue out there. We've had a great few days after the trade truce was announced between US, and China. And a counter move here at this point in time wouldn't be too surprising as, investors reconsolidate and evaluate the longer-term outlook, which I think unambiguously has turned more positive. Well, this represents, in my view, a significant de-escalation between US and China in terms of the countermeasures that China has put out. And also, we know that rare earths are a critical component for the defense industry, for various infrastructure industries, and this means that the level of disruption both in the US and the rest of the world that are dependent on these rare earths exports from China. China has a monopoly on a lot of these rare earths, will be minimized. And I think going forward, this bodes well for what we can expect in terms of the trade talk between US and China. There will be a sign of relief for many investors in these sectors. Well, first of all, there has been a certain stockpile and inventory built up before this. But I think it was a matter of months before, they were run down. So I think the fact that, there was significant de-escalation between these two countries, that, exports from China can resume, means that the tail risk in terms of earnings for companies in this sector has been significantly reduced. And I think that this is a positive development for sure. Diversification absolutely makes sense. I think, for a long time now, investors have their portfolios dominated in the US dollar. Now, the issue right now is we've probably seen the peak of dollar strength for a while right now with, the twin deficit in the US, with the economic uncertainty there. And this means that it does make sense to diversify out of the dollar at the margin. We like the euro. We think the outlook for that currency is particularly bright. The Singapore dollar is a bright spot as well. And we see some appreciation in the Japanese yen going forward as well.
And that'll do it for business. Utali.
Thanks so very much for that, Roland. Time now for another break, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, India rejects China's bid to rename more than 24 sites in contested territory. It's a list that includes names of mountains, rivers, and residential areas. How might this move influence Beijing's territorial claims? Well, we'll be speaking with an expert. And new China-Vietnam railway links are set to transform cross-border trade and tourism between the two neighbors. Hi there, you're watching East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines we are following. The APEC trade meeting gets underway in South Korea. The bloc flagging that export growth in the Asia-Pacific region is set to stall this year due to the U.S.-driven trade war. Washington warns companies anywhere in the world against using Huawei chips, a move seen as a bid to counter China's growing AI dominance. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky arrives in Turkiye in the last hour, ahead of direct talks to end the 3-year-long Russia-Ukraine conflict. But a war of words erupts between the two sides, dimming hopes of any major breakthrough. China has reasserted its territorial claims in a contested border with India, releasing its own list of renamed places in Indian-controlled territory. Now, most of the 27 locations renamed are in Arunachal Pradesh. China calls the territory Zangnan and says it's part of the Tibetan Autonomous Region. Each location was assigned a name in Chinese characters, Tibetan and Pinyin, accompanied by detailed geographical coordinates. The Chinese government says it is its right to do so.
藏南地区是中国领土，中国政府对藏南地区部分地名进行了标准化处理，这完全是中国主权范围内的事。
Well, India has since dismissed China's move as, quote, vain and preposterous. Relations had seemed to be on the mend a month ago when Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke positively about the relationship with Beijing. China has been India's top trade partner. They cooperate multilaterally, from BRICS to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and they share interests in advancing non-Western economic models. But China's border issues are nothing new. The country has disputes with India and Bhutan when it comes to land borders. Beijing also has a dispute with Tokyo over a group of uninhabited islands known as the Senkaku Islands. China calls them the Diaoyu Islands. All right, for more analysis, let's speak with author and historian Victoria Schofield. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Victoria. Now, just want to get your historian's perspective. Firstly, how significant are place names in shaping territorial narratives? And have we seen similar renaming tactics used effectively in the past?
Well, you're correct. It's very significant, especially from the China-India point of view. I think what one has to realize is that the immense frontier over 300 miles has always been disputed ever since China became the communist government of China and India gained its independence, and more especially since China took over Tibet, because that brought the border, the disputed frontier, to India. And if you go back into history, you look at the conversations between Zhou Enlai and Prime Minister Nehru in the 1950s. Even the Chinese premier at that time warned, if we don't solve this these border issues, we're going to continue to argue about them. And this is what you're having, because these places are at immense altitudes and it's extremely difficult actually to demarcate the frontier, but they haven't done so. And consequently, the claims and counterclaims of who owns which piece of territory continue.
So in the eyes of international law, how do place names and map labels, influence these territorial claims?
Well, it really depends who's produced the map. Because, for example, in India's case, it's produced the map which shows the region as part of India. And that's the map, the official map that they will work by. China will produce a different map, and that's the map it will work by. And this goes back to the days even of the British, when they sent out cartographers to try and demarcate this territory. But as I emphasized, it's extremely difficult because we're talking about very high altitudes. And the other area, of course, which China claims and which caused fighting in 1962 along with Arunachal Pradesh was the Aksai Chin in eastern Ladakh. And this is where China and India both continue to rename the places according to what they consider is to be their territory. China claims the border is in Aksai Chin, quite well into what India claims is still eastern Ladakh. And on Indian maps, that appears as eastern Ladakh.
So what all the renaming efforts that we see what Beijing is trying to do here, What does that tell us about its long-term approach to disputed territories like Arunachal Pradesh, for instance?
Well, I think the difficulty, particularly with Arunachal Pradesh, was that when they fought the 62 war, which, as we know, was very brutal, and they hadn't come to blows again until 2020, it was more or less assumed that if India takes control of Arunachal Pradesh, India will stop complaining about China being in occupation of Aksai Chin, although they have not acknowledged it officially. And as I say, it still appears in Indian maps as part of India. But this latest move is really a sort of a sabre-rattling in a way to indicate that this is not resolved. We still claim this territory. And what I think is also very interesting, it's come at a time when, as you know, India and Pakistan have just drawn back from some serious military encounters in the past weeks, and believed and verbally supported and believed to be supported by China on Pakistan's side. And so it's quite significant that China has chosen this moment in time to announce the renaming of this over 24 locations.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up about the India-Pakistan relations and how you've highlighted that, because I'm wondering about the regional ripple effects you see. How do you think other countries are likely to interpret this move, and does it, do you see it encouraging similar actions elsewhere?
Well, I think we've got to keep it in its regional context and understand what's going on between India, China, Pakistan, China, and of course, in the greater context, China and the United States. And what I would read out of this is it's China showing itself at its strength. It's not going to be kowtowed by anyone, and this is what it considers to be the correct position. And as I say, I think we can't underestimate the timing when this has occurred. And as we know, China has claims on other areas, notably Taiwan. And so we have to really wait and see whether this translates into more aggressive action, or whether it's just this is our position, we know you've got your position, but we are, for the international purposes, making it very clear that we do believe these locations are Chinese.
Right. And we know that, China's always sort of playing that long game approach, and this time it's through maps, it's through names and symbolism. How does that compare to perhaps the more conventional historical methods of trying to assert control over disputed regions?
Well, I think we're not in that phase at the moment. However, as I say, you have to look at this in parallel with what's going on in Aksai Chin. There has been a very gradual encroachment, heavily fortified on both sides, I might add, along the dividing line, which, as I say, if you look very clearly on the map, you'll see where Aksai Chin is. And this is where Chinese have built fortifications. They've been building tunnels. India has complained it's built a road nearby because, as we know, the road originally, which China built, was built in the late 1950s, in order to have better access between Xinjiang and Tibet. And that was unnoticed at the time until it was really announced that we built the highest highway in the world. And this is an area of continual contention. It's less reported about because it's very inaccessible, over 11,000 feet high. And you have to, over 11,000 meters high, sorry. And you have to realize how difficult it is for a journalist, for example, to know exactly what's going on. Plus, you've got military there, so they're not very welcoming to journalists. And as I say, this is a sort of tussle for borders between China and India, which has been ongoing. And I think will continue until both sides decide, well, actually, we want to settle who controls which particular mountain and which particular river.
Oh, many thanks for your time and thoughts there. Victoria Schofield, author and historian. Now, long-discussed cross-border railway links between China and Vietnam are set to be a game-changer for Hanoi, with increased trade and tourism expected between the countries. However, experts say Vietnam is likely to be cautious in balancing its relationship with its superpower neighbor, even as the initiatives received a boost during Chinese President Xi Jinping's recent visit. Olivia Seong reports from Hanoi.
67-year-old Ma Ronghong is visiting Vietnam for the first time. The retiree hails from southwestern China's Chengdu city and is on a 12-day tour which sets off from the city of Nanning in China's southern Guangxi province through Vietnam by train. We caught up with him while in Hanoi.
远亲不如近邻嘛，现在交通稍稍差一点嘛，这个跟不上中国，老实说，今后把这最后1公里搞好，肯定对大家都双赢啊。
This could become a reality with new cross-border rail links between China and Vietnam on the cards. Currently, passengers and goods must swap trains at the border because the dated Vietnamese railway gauge is incompatible with China's high-speed railway. Tour guide Zhou Jianwei says this would mean greater ease in handling its large groups, which go up to 300 participants each time. The agency already runs about 5 of such tours each month, up from 1 a month when it first started in April last year.
所有的客人不会旅途那么劳累了，就没有那些倒车呀、过关的一系列的问题，就简化了很多，方便了很多。我希望这条列车早一点开通。
China and Vietnam have long discussed collaboration on 3 railway projects, and during a visit by Chinese President Xi Jinping to Hanoi in April, China and Vietnam launched a new railway cooperation mechanism with the goal of aligning railway gauges in both countries. An agreement to conduct feasibility studies for 2 of these projects was also inked, while a 3rd railway line is set to begin construction this year.
The new rail project is expected to be a game changer for Vietnam, and from what we know so far, there will be 18 stations along the entire line, including here in the capital, Hanoi. Trains will also be able to travel at top speeds of 160 kilometers per hour, transporting not just people, but goods as well.
The 403-kilometer passenger and freight line is expected to connect Kunming in China's south to Laogai at the border in Vietnam, through capital Hanoi to reach its northern coast, Haiphong, a key international port. An upgrade too for Vietnam's aging railway infrastructure, which dates back to French colonial times, the $8 billion project to be partially funded through Chinese loans.
Đối với người dân Việt Nam thì theo mình nghĩ là có nhiều tuyến đường sắt thì du khách sẽ có nhiều những cái sự lựa chọn về các phương tiện đi khác nhau. Và tàu ví dụ như là nếu như mình đi Trung Quốc mình thường hay đi ô tô thì những cái chuyến đi chơi hoặc đi du lịch cùng những người bạn thì mình sẽ lựa chọn tàu để mình có thể đi trải nghiệm được nhiều hơn là so với những cái phương tiện công cộng khác. Đấy, mình nghĩ rằng tàu từ Trung Quốc, từ Hà Nội tới Trung Quốc đi bằng tàu cũng là như thế thì sẽ rất là thuận lợi cho việc giao thương. Vì ở bến cảng Hải Phòng là bến cảng rất lớn, từ xưa đến nay là bến cảng rất lớn. Nên là sẽ rút ngắn được rất nhiều thời gian di chuyển từ Hải Phòng và phải qua Hà Nội sau đó mới lên đến Lào Cai, thì bây giờ là đi thẳng lên Lào Cai.
Vietnam's top leader To Lâm said building the 3 railways was the highest priority in infrastructure cooperation between the 2 countries, calling on China to offer concessional loans.
The prioritized goals of Vietnamese leaders at the moment is to enhance its economic development and to diversify away from any single partner, which is the United States.
Dr. Nguyen pointed out that the bilateral agreements announced during President Xi's visit have been limited to cross-border projects. It did not involve Vietnam's larger north-south high-speed railway project set to link Hanoi in the north with Ho Chi Minh in the south in around 6 hours.
The rationale is that because it's connecting Vietnam and China, so China should be a prioritized partner in financing and in providing the know-how. And secondly, if the project is lagging behind, it's only within the one specific geographical area in the North Vietnam, not all over the country, because the North-South project is very important and it's connecting, basically the whole length of Vietnam. So it would need to be considered much more in terms of security and defense as well.
This comes as China has been on a charm offensive, seeking deeper cooperation with its trading partners, especially in Southeast Asia, in the face of a bruising trade war with the US. Olivia Seong, CNA, Hanoi.
Germany and the Philippines have agreed to enhance defense ties and boost cooperation in other areas, including cybersecurity and arms. Philippine Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro and German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius signed the deal in Berlin yesterday. Well, the pact follows a visit by Mr. Pistorius to Manila last year, when he and Mr. Teodoro committed to improving long-term relations between their military forces. Well, the latest deal with Berlin adds to Manila's growing list of defense cooperation agreements, or rather arrangements, beyond its traditional ally Washington since President Trump's return to power. The Philippines signed a deal for expanded military cooperation with New Zealand last month and is expected to complete a similar pact with Canada soon. Manila also ratified a reciprocal access deal with Tokyo last December, and President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has given the green light to start negotiations with France for a visiting forces agreement. Well, the series of moves come as tensions with Beijing simmer due to overlapping territorial claims in a disputed South China Sea. Coming up on East Asia tonight, Chinese students who want a world-class education forced to rethink their American dream under President Trump's policies. The U.S. has been the top choice for Chinese students who want a world-class education and global jobs. But growing anti-immigrant rhetoric and restrictive policies under President Donald Trump are making some think twice. Well, CNA's Insight finds out how prospective students are affected and whether the American dream is still within reach.
For years, the U.S. has consistently ranked as the top global destination for higher education. In Beijing, China, 17-year-old Li Xiaoxing had always hoped to study stateside.
因为美国是一个多元化的一个地方，然后呢，它有这种无限可能嘛。美国就跟另一个地球，地球上另一个地球一样，我那种感觉，你就能有更多的阅历、更多的经验，然后能让你甚至可能在就是将来世界各地的这个就业上都有很大的帮助。
上学这件事儿，还是这个坚定自己的这个想法的，是吧？
嗯。小时候经常我爸妈会带我去美国旅行，然后我在那边去过很多这种主题公园，像乐高公园、迪士尼或者那个环球影城。我在那边就是这些主题公园里，感觉就非常的快乐。然后当时我小时候就觉得，这么好的地方，我以后我上学我天天都在这个地方待着。
Xiaoxing is due to graduate high school next year, but now he's uncertain about his American ambitions. In March, a Republican congressman proposed a bill to stop the issuance of visas to Chinese students.
就那天晚上选总统的时候，我记得特清楚。最后特朗普上来了，然后上来马上就提了那个提案，就是对留学生非常不好的那种签证的那个提案。然后我就我就是真特害怕，因为我从1年级到现在，我一直学的都是就是国际的课程，所以可以说我没有回头路，我只有上美国这条路。所以如果说哪天特朗普就因为一句话，然后我这条路走不了了，那我真不知道我应该怎么办。
International students contribute over $40 billion to the U.S. economy annually. Every 3 international students creates 1 job in America through their tuition fees and demand for goods and services.
The dependence on students coming from abroad in the U.S. is very heavy. So anything that has a fear factor or a threat is going to have severe impact on the education system of U.S. itself, because that big chunk of money that's coming will stop. And that stops innovation.
Asia is the largest source of international students to the U.S. India and China top the list, while South Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, and Japan are major origin countries. Popular fields of study include engineering and computing. In Beijing, 17-year-old Xiaoxing has spent his entire education preparing for one goal: to study in the U.S. He has made multiple applications for a U.S. student visa to study in American college prep schools.
当时我们3次拒签之后，然后我妈就连续不高兴了几天。
Xiaoxing is giving it one last shot in May. Should his visa application fail again, he and his family will have to make alternate plans.
说实在不行，咱去法国也行。所以说，我就按照我妈的那个想法，然后她给我报了一个法语课，然后每周6我都去上。虽然说挺累的，真挺累的，因为周6我要上5、6个小时的法语课，就是一整天。但是呢，肯定非常有意义，毕竟是学习嘛。对，我觉得可以留个后路，这算可以留个后路。
因为我们有过被拒签的经历，所以也是很担心，就是说孩子，再去签这个签证的时候被拒签，所以也希望这个移民的政策能够更加的人性化吧。
Students are going to try to go places where they feel like they're welcome, and the United States right now does not seem to welcome international students.
If the students stop going there, the talent pool in the US also reduces. So in 10 years you will see the impact. You won't see it now.
And you can catch the full episode of Insight, Trump's 100 Days, Asia and Migration, tonight on CNA or on YouTube and MeWatch at 9 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time. And now some headlines from media outlets in East Asia. A South China Morning Post report says that Chinese institutions are increasingly ramping up its recruitment of US-based Chinese researchers. Large salary packages come standard, and that could be the pull factor academics are looking for amid heightened scrutiny and shrinking academic freedoms under the Trump administration. In Japan, the Yomiuri Shimbun says the government is looking to create a new think tank to boost its economic security research. It aims to look into risks such as disruptions to electricity supply and essential materials, including semiconductors. The proposed group is expected to team up with private businesses and government departments, both locally and abroad. In South Korea's Yonhap News says police have detained 2 people accused of blackmailing football star Son Heung-min with fake pregnancy claims. The duo are a woman in her 20s and a man in his 40s. And ahead on Asia tonight, the expected Russia-Ukraine peace talks in Istanbul cast in doubt as the two sides trade insults. Moscow calls Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky a clown and a loser after the leader referred to the Russian delegation as dummy. And we speak with our digital correspondent about the crucial role of migrant workers in both their host and home countries. These stories and more on Asia tonight, 8 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time, right here on CNA. And that wraps up East Asia tonight this Thursday. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. And you can also find us on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for watching.